Hello, welcome to week 1, lesson 1 of the Castro unit. Let's get into it. Alright, this is the lecture video for it. I'm going off these Castro outline notes so you can use what I'm saying right now along with these outline notes to form your own answers to the questions that are going to be due at the end of the lesson. Okay, so we start with, this week, Castro's rise to power. So this goes until 1959. Before Castro rose to power, we're going to talk about where Cuba was at and kind of the small history behind it. Okay, so Cuba was led by a guy named Fulgencio Batista by the time that Castro took over. Okay, in the middle of the 20th century, by then Cuba was one of the richest countries in Latin America. The weakness of Cuba at this point was that most of its wealth was based off of one homegrown crop, sugar. Okay. Sugar and the production and the selling of sugar accounted for 60% of the workforce and 25% of all the island's exports. Okay, their economy was not diversified. It was based on that sugar crop. Its biggest purchaser, its main purchaser, was the United States. So the U.S. had a big hold on the Cuban economy, meaning they could exert economic, political influence over Cuba due to the leverage they had over being the sole purchaser of this crop. And it's the sole source of Cuba's money, so to speak. Okay, so the U.S. had a lot of influence based off that, but they had influence on other issues too, not related to economic issues, and that all began with the Spanish-American War. Okay, in 1898, U.S. fought a war against Spain, the Spanish-American War, where the U.S. got control of Cuba from Spain at the end of that war. Eventually, they granted Cuba their independence, but not without conditions, and that is where the Platt Amendments come in of 1901 and 1903. Number one, Cuba could not enter into an agreement with a third power. That is, with any power, not the United States. Eventually, you're going to see this come into play with, the Soviet Union. Number two, the U.S. had the right to intervene militarily in Cuba for any reason whatsoever. And number three, Guantanamo Bay on the eastern tip of Cuba was leased to the United States. This is where things are today. This is, in 2020, the U.S. can, detain terrorists, and they do all the time at Guantanamo Bay. So the U.S. uses Guantanamo Bay to this day. It's very important to the United States, and that all came out here in these Platt Amendments. Okay. All national movements seeking Cuba's complete independence regarding the breaking of the United States dominance as a necessary first step. However, the same had to take second place to Cuba's economic needs. Essentially, all these movements rising in Cuba said we need to completely break from U.S. dominance somehow. This might require us to diversify our economic portfolio so we're not just dealing with sugar, because in order to break from the U.S.'s economic and political grasp, we have to break the Platt Amendments, but also we have to break the fact that our sole source of income, or one of our sole sources of income, is sugar. If that makes sense. So then we don't have the United States having so much influence over being our only purchaser of this crop. Okay, so Fulgencio Batista, he's a general. He began his career as a dedicated defender of Cuban rights against the United States. That's how he started. He was the head of the Cuban army. He legitimately held power as president in the early 1940s. He had adopted enlightened social and economic policies to limit the privileges of landowners and reduce poverty. He lost office, and when he lost office, he went to live in the United States for some time. He then returned to Cuba in 1952. He seized power in a military coup, and he completely changed his tune in regards to policies with the United States and Cuba. He reversed earlier policies. He started embarking on these repressive measures aimed at gaining the support of the privileged elites. So those would be the landowners and the owners of large sugar plantations. So it's at this point that he's not populist anymore. He goes and he's like, oh yes, United States, I love you. I love you, wealthy people. When he did this, corruption worsened in Cuba. In return for getting U.S. dollars for his regime, Batista then, in a quid pro quo, allowed corruption to flourish. Havana became a playground for wealthy Americans that were crossing in from Florida. Americans brought money, but they also brought drugs, prostitution, and racketeering. The ruling class in Cuba was predominantly white and of Spanish extraction. And the poor underclass was mostly black with African roots. Okay, so not only do you see this vast economic divide and political divide, but you also see racial elements kind of play into it as well. So there's opposition to Batista. Batista gained a reputation as a fierce dictator, and his rule became increasingly coercive because of that. So there's a number of opposition groups that were formed, united in opposition to Batista. Okay, these would be three different groups. Number one, student organizations. Okay, so university organizations that are forming opposition to this government. Number two, people that live in the rural areas, campos, the agricultural workers. And number three, the Communist Party. We've seen this trend in different countries, right, throughout the Cold War. Batista initially drew on three main sources of support for his regime: the army, the labor unions, the United States. However, this support lessened over time, and Batista had a loss of favor with important sections of opinion back in the United States. Public opinion in the U.S. started turning against Batista, and this was particularly damaging to him. So now enter Fidel Castro. Fidel Castro was born in 1927. He was the illegitimate son of a farmer. He had the conventional education most boys did at that time, attended a Catholic school. He went to Havana University. He studied law and organized demonstrations and protests on behalf of underpaid workers. Castro left Cuba in 1947 for a time to join a unsuccessful attempt to bring down a guy named Rafael Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, and also help participate in uprisings in the country Colombia. He came back to Cuba and he practiced as a lawyer. At that time, Castro joined the Partido Ortodoxo in the late 1940s. He was a socialist, yet he was not a communist at this point. After 1952, the only way Castro can now operate was as an anti-Batista rebel. Okay, so he's rising up through the political ranks through this party. He becomes very, very anti-establishment, very populist. Okay, it's important to remember at this point too, he is not communist. Okay, he is just very, very nationalist, Cuban nationalist. You'll see eventually he becomes communist because that is the most convenient way to achieve his nationalist goals. This is not like the Soviet Union, where you had Vladimir Lenin and Stalin, who were more so communist and trying to fit their country within their own interpretation of communism. That is not how Castroism is. Castroism is putting Cuba first, and whatever in communism, as you'll see later on, provides the easiest vehicle for that to occur. So there's something called the Moncada Barracks attack, and this happened in 1953. Okay. This was Castro's first major move against Batista. With some followers, he attempted to seize the Moncada military barracks outside of a city called Santiago. These barracks housed units of Batista's army. So Castro's intention in this uprising was to strike a blow against the new regime before it consolidated itself, and thus rally hesitant opponents of Batista to act together against him. So remember, Batista overthrew the government in Cuba through a military coup around 1953. Okay, so timeline-wise, Castro's attack here, the Moncada Barracks attack, happened like right after Batista seized power, soon after. A number of attackers led by Castro were variously estimated between 160 and 180 people. They were composed largely of poor agricultural and factory workers, containing only two known communists at this time. So it was like very, very just populist. They lacked weapons and military experience, and they were no match for the 1,000 professional soldiers they were encountering in these military barracks. You might wonder why they thought they could achieve something by attacking these barracks of people with guns and a lot more experience. That might be a reason why it led to a failure, if you have to answer that type of question later. Castro and his brother Raul and others were captured quite easily, and it was a complete failure. So Fidel Castro is now put on trial. Okay, Castro used his trial as a platform to defend himself as a committed Cuban patriot fighting for the liberty of the Cuban people. Okay, in this trial speech, he uttered the very memorable, famous phrase, "History will absolve me." That means that history will show that I was right, and I did what was right. He claimed in a pamphlet later on in which he developed the ideas he'd expressed in his trial speech. They expressed the following ideas. Number one, he wanted to restore the Constitution that had been destroyed by Batista's military uprising, military coup. Number two, he wanted to redistribute land to the people, so land reform was big with him. Number three, he wanted to extend education to all the people. Number four, he wanted to end corruption in politics and in business. Number five, he wanted to grant 30% of the profits of industrial enterprises to the workers. And number six, he wanted to cut wasteful government weapons expenditure. So basically, bills racked up through buying weapons and military stuff through the government. He wanted to cut that wasteful stuff. So Castro was sentenced to a 15-year prison term. This was later commuted, and he was released in 1955 after serving less than 2 years. After he got out of jail, he formed the 26th July movement. The title was adopted to describe Castro's rebel movement inspired by the Moncada attack. So the Moncada attack happened on the 26th of July. Castro then went to Mexico soon after his release and began training a small band of fellow exiles. So he learned his lesson from the Moncada barrack attacks and realized that he needed to train these forces. This is where he met an Argentinian doctor and a Marxist revolutionary named Che Guevara. Che Guevara eventually kind of gives Castro his communist leanings and really helps him out in organizing these attacks. And that's where week 1, lesson 1 ends. And like and subscribe. See ya.